Supreme Warlord Dravik was feared throughout the galaxy, and his reputation preceded him. Clad in sleek, dark armor and surrounded by advisors, he was calculating, with a mind as sharp as any weapon in his arsenal. He was indifferent to the cultures or people he conquered, seeing only resources to plunder and strategic ground to occupy. His interest in Earth, a comparatively small and isolated planet, was pragmatic. Its resources and unique position at the edge of a quiet sector offered an ideal staging ground for further expansion. The decision was simple. Earth would fall. It was merely a matter of time. But Earth's resistance to subjugation would soon frustrate even the Empire's might. Dravik had received intelligence reports on Earth's technological status. Primitive, relying on outdated, cumbersome projectile weapons. Their defenses were laughably rudimentary compared to the Empire's sophisticated arsenal of energy weapons, gravity modulators, and advanced bio-soldiers. His advisors urged him to press forward, assuring him that Earth's inhabitants would pose no threat. The Empire could launch a small invasion force, and it would still be more than enough to seize control. Yet, within the shadows of Dravik's intelligence network, Earth had placed its own spies. Humanity, though young in the galaxy, was cunning and adaptive. Its leaders had been covertly monitoring Dravik's interests in Earth, intercepting messages, analyzing ship movements, and carefully preparing for the inevitable confrontation. The Galactic Empire believed itself unseen, its plans impenetrable. But humans had learned the art of survival against impossible odds. Despite lacking advanced technology, Earth's best minds had devised a strategy that could buy them the upper hand. In a hidden bunker buried beneath a mountain on Earth, military strategists huddled around holographic projections of the Empire's known fleet formations and potential attack routes. General Amara West, a hard-edged, seasoned strategist with a history in psychological warfare, paced as she listened to her fellow leaders. Her eyes burned with determination as she processed each piece of intelligence with practiced precision. "The Empire's biggest weakness," she began, her voice as sharp as a blade, "is its pride. They believe we're no better than savages, incapable of mounting a defense. They're expecting a weak, disorganized resistance. We can use that to our advantage." The plan she proposed was as simple as it was audacious. They would send Earth's weakest soldiers to an alien battlefield, presenting them as the finest humanity had to offer. They would craft a convincing ruse that these soldiers were Earth's elite, giving the Empire a false sense of superiority. But these weakest were no ordinary soldiers. They were seasoned survivors, handpicked for their adaptability and survival instincts. By deploying them to a frozen, desolate planet with hostile terrain, Earth could showcase their tenacity without revealing their full strength. Across the table sat Captain Liam Torres, a former scout with a knack for improvisation in the field. Lean and wiry, he was unassuming at first glance, but his sharp gaze suggested a mind that thrived in the unpredictable chaos of battle. Torres saw the brilliance in West's plan, his grin growing as he imagined the Empire's soldiers floundering against Earth's hidden strengths. "This alien planet, the one covered in ice and storms," Torres said, leaning forward. "It's not just inhospitable. It's a death trap for anyone unprepared. If our people can adapt to it, we'll have the home advantage." West nodded. "Exactly. It's not about brute force. We're playing a game of perception. The Empire's troops are highly trained but accustomed to controlled environments. They don't know survival like our people do. In their eyes, we're sending our best, but in reality, we're sending soldiers who know how to endure, because that's what this will take." The room filled with an understanding silence as they realized the depth of the deception. It wasn't just a gamble. It was a calculated maneuver, using the Empire's arrogance against them. The Galactic Empire had never encountered resistance like this, where opponents played to their weaknesses rather than matching them in raw power. Earth would make them doubt their assumptions. As the meeting concluded, West dispatched a message across Earth's military channels. Operation Snowfall is in effect. The plan was set into motion, and the weakest soldiers began their journey to the frozen planet, a journey that would become a silent testament to Earth's resilience. Meanwhile, Back on Neros Prime, Supreme Warlord Dravik received word that Earth's defenses were even weaker than anticipated. His spies reported that Earth's forces, believing in their primitive strength, were sending their best soldiers to meet the Empires. He scoffed, a cruel smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Let them come," he muttered. "We'll crush them in one fell swoop." Little did he know. The stage was set for a trap of epic proportions, one that would expose the Empire's vulnerabilities and shift the balance of power. Earth's weakest soldiers were about to show the Galactic Empire what resilience truly meant. And with that, the clash of wills began, a confrontation where humanity's ingenuity and defiance would be tested against the galaxy's mightiest force. The end was nowhere in sight, but the first move had been made. The frozen world loomed below as Earth's strike vessel, the heroic, pierced the dense, swirling clouds. Snowstorms raged across the surface, casting a haunting, bluish haze that blanketed the entire landscape. Inside the ship, Captain Liam Torres braced himself against the cold metal wall, feeling the descent's tremors reverberate through his bones. This planet, known as Valzer, was as treacherous as they came, a barren, icy wasteland battered by constant storms and near-zero visibility. The soldiers with him, Earth's so-called weakest, were anything but ordinary. They were misfits by military standards. Too rough around the edges, more accustomed to surviving in harsh, wild terrains and following precise, traditional protocols. Each one bore the scars of battles that hadn't required superior weaponry, only sheer endurance. They were united by one quality the Empire couldn't grasp: resilience. Torres glanced at his squad as they donned their worn yet reliable armor. Corporal Jess Novak, a compact but sturdy woman with piercing eyes, checked her survival pack with swift, practiced motions. She had trained in the frozen tundras of the northern territories on Earth, surviving months alone where most would have perished within days. Beside her, Sergeant Vic Norton, a towering figure with hands calloused from years of training in remote mountains, tested the grip on his modified grappling hook. Each soldier carried gear that wasn't flashy but functional, adapted for survival over sustained combat. Torres addressed them, his voice firm and focused. "Remember, this isn't a show of strength. It's about lasting longer than they can. We're here to make them believe they're outmatched, to make them doubt every step they take." They nodded, expressions solemn but determined. The mission was clear. They were here not only to defend but to mislead, to create the illusion of an unstoppable force among Earth's elite. The Empire had no idea what it had walked into, and that was exactly how Earth wanted it. The heroic touched down, its ramp descending onto the frozen surface with a hiss of releasing pressure. The biting wind immediately cut through their gear, stinging any exposed skin and sending an icy shiver through the squad. The planet's atmosphere was oxygen-thin and frigid, a punishing environment that demanded constant vigilance. Around them, jagged cliffs and icy ridges loomed, shadows stretching like claws across the snowy plains. As they moved out in staggered formation, Torres noticed the telltale hum of an approaching enemy craft. The Empire's sleek, black shuttle pierced through the clouds above, its gleaming hull bearing the Empire's blood-red insignia, a symbol of fear across countless systems. The Empire's soldiers disembarked, moving with a synchronized precision that spoke of years of relentless training. Clad in dark armor that glistened in the stormlight, they stepped onto the snowy ground, their disdainful glances barely concealed behind their visors. Torres studied them from a distance, signaling his team to hold. He saw the arrogance in their movements, the way they looked at Valzer, as if it were merely another obstacle to be conquered. But Earth's soldiers had one critical advantage. They knew how to use the environment, while the Empire's soldiers seemed almost repulsed by it, as though nature itself was an inconvenience. Torres grinned. Time to introduce them to Valzer. He raised a hand, signaling Novak and Norton to move to flanking positions. They moved like shadows, blending into the swirling snow, while Torres kept his gaze locked on the enemy squad. The Empire's soldiers trudged forward, their advanced weaponry gleaming. their every step oozing confidence. Then, as they advanced, the traps began to spring. Novak triggered a camouflage snare she'd set along their path. A wall of snow tumbled down from an overhead ridge, catching 2 Empire soldiers off guard, knocking them to the ground. Their comrades immediately aimed their weapons, trying to locate the source, but the falling snow had already obscured any sign of Novak. Their precision training meant little when the landscape itself became an enemy. Torres pressed forward with his team, using the Empire's hesitation to reposition. They're rattled. He whispered into his calm, "Keep them guessing." Norton struck next, activating a series of low-level EMP charges hidden under the snow. The pulses disrupted the Empire's soldiers' communications and shorted out several visor displays. In the ensuing disorientation, they fired blindly into the swirling white mist, each blast lighting up the storm like silent, deadly fireworks. From his position, Torres saw the Empire's squad leader grow visibly frustrated, his posture stiffening as his commands failed to cut through the interference. These were soldiers trained for clean, precise battles, not the chaos and unpredictability of guerrilla tactics in hostile terrain. They couldn't see their enemy, couldn't anticipate their next move, and every moment they wasted on the planet's surface was another victory for Earth. A sudden gust sent a fresh wave of snow cascading around them, and Torres saw his opportunity. "Let's move," he ordered, leading his squad through a narrow ravine. As they vanished from sight, he could hear the Empire's squad leader shouting for a regroup, his voice tinged with desperation. By the time the Empire's forces scrambled to reform their lines, Earth's soldiers were long gone, leaving only the imprints of their boots in the snow. The Empire's soldiers were left bewildered, cold, and increasingly doubtful. Already, whispers circulated among them. If this was Earth's best, perhaps their conquest would not be as swift or simple as they had imagined. As Torres and his team settled into a hidden overlook, he allowed himself a small smile. The Empire had expected to find a weaker, primitive force here on Valzer. Instead, they had found survivors. Soldiers who understood that true strength wasn't just in weaponry or tactics, but in the ability to endure. Torres glanced at his team, nodding approvingly as they took up their next positions. The Empire had taken the bait, and Earth's trap was only just beginning to spring. The cold, alien landscape of Valzer stretched endlessly in every direction, a snow-covered battlefield where survival came not from sheer strength but from cunning. As Captain Liam Torres peered through the narrow gap in the icy rocks that hid his team, he watched the Empire's soldiers regroup, their frustration palpable. Already weakened by the relentless environment, they were walking into a war that demanded more than raw power. It required adaptability, patience, and an ability to endure uncertainty. "Keep them on edge," Torres whispered into his calm, addressing his team. "No direct hits. Make every move feel like a threat." He didn't need to tell them twice. Novak was already on the ridge above, setting a series of reflective traps, using shards of ice and metallic foil. Each glint she strategically placed would catch the faint, ghostly light filtering through the storm, appearing to the enemy like the flash of weapon sights. For a highly trained force accustomed to structured, predictable assaults, these small tricks were maddeningly disorienting. The Empire's squad, now scattered and visibly rattled, glanced nervously at each glimmer, their weapons snapping up only to aim at empty shadows. Every few minutes, a faint rustling or a quick, unseen movement would send them into another scramble, forcing them to shift and reposition, never quite able to find the source. To them, it must have seemed like the humans were everywhere and nowhere at once. Sergeant Vic Norton watched the chaos below with quiet satisfaction. He adjusted his pack, securing a few crude but effective devices, noise traps fashioned from scraps and small, percussion-triggered charges. These weren't designed to kill. Rather, they would burst with sharp cracks, echoing across the ice and making the Empire's soldiers believe they were constantly under threat. "Are they ready for the next round of surprises?" Norton murmured into his calm. "Always," Torres replied, a smile in his voice. "Let's turn up the pressure." Norton moved down the incline, his massive form blending in with the dense snowfall. He triggered one of his noise traps, a small device that emitted a loud, unsettling roar that sounded like an incoming avalanche. The Empire soldiers instinctively took cover, crouching low, their confidence visibly eroding. Every tactic the humans employed chipped away at their composure, eroding the solid unity they prided themselves on. Their squad leader, Lieutenant Iraq, tried to maintain control, barking orders to steady his soldiers. But his voice was tinged with frustration. This was supposed to be an easy sweep, a lesson to the humans that the Empire's might was unstoppable. Yet here they were, scrambling, disoriented, and cold in an environment that refused to accommodate their technology or tactics. His team's thermal armor and energy weapons, advanced as they were proving cumbersome and unreliable in Valzer's unforgiving climate. And with each passing moment, his soldiers were becoming less soldiers and more desperate survivors. Meanwhile, Torres and his team watched from above, every movement calculated, every silence weighted with purpose. They had no advanced tech, no energy weapons. Instead, they had something far more potent, the ability to adapt. Then, in a bold maneuver, Novak slid down a nearby slope, coming into clear sight of the enemy for just a split second, enough to lure them into action. Iraq shouted a command, and his soldiers unleashed a barrage of energy bolts, each blast slicing through the blizzard only to miss Novak entirely as she vanished into the snow-dusted rocks. Their firepower was impressive but wasted, each shot scattering harmlessly into the frozen wilderness. With every wasted shot, their battery levels dropped, and the Empire soldiers grew visibly angrier and more drained. "Captain, they're running on fumes," Novak whispered, concealed behind a jagged outcropping. "They can't keep this up much longer." "Perfect. Let them chase shadows," Torres replied, nodding to Norton. It was time for the final phase of their psychological assault. Norton planted their last series of low-impact charges, each strategically placed in the snow to simulate footsteps leading away from their hidden position. As the Empire soldiers followed the decoy trail, the charges exploded with loud, deafening bursts that echoed across the ice fields. Disoriented and exhausted, the Empire soldiers finally faltered, lowering their weapons as their breaths heaved in visible clouds of steam, their movements sluggish. Lieutenant Iraq looked around at his depleted squad, desperation breaking through his stoic mask. He tapped at his wrist communicator, trying to raise their ship for evacuation, but the thin atmosphere and freezing temperatures interfered, distorting his transmission. It was a stark realization. Here, on this forsaken planet, even the Empire's finest were vulnerable. At that moment, Torres stepped out from behind his cover, allowing himself to be seen from a distance. He held his rifle casually, but his gaze was piercing, a silent message of defiance and control. The Empire soldiers paused, shocked at the sight of him alone and unafraid. Torres held their gaze for a beat longer, then raised his fist high into the air, a symbol Earth's soldiers used as a mark of defiance. Seeing him standing there so certain drove the final nail into their morale. The Empire's soldiers, worn and exhausted, glanced uncertainly at each other, the cracks in their unity now impossible to ignore. Here was an enemy they had dismissed, expected to conquer with ease, and yet they could barely keep up. The faintest hint of fear flickered in their eyes, their willpower waning. Without a word, Torres turned and disappeared back into the storm, leaving only his boot prints in the snow. The Empire soldiers watched the trail disappear into the blizzard, a line they no longer dared to follow. "Regroup," Iraq muttered to his team, his voice subdued. The once proud force now looked small and hesitant, as if the very cold had seeped into their resolve, freezing it solid. They huddled together, trying to maintain what was left of their composure. High above, hidden once more, Torres signaled to his team. "They're done," he said softly. "They're not invincible. They just needed reminding." The battle had been one of wits and endurance, a clash that exposed the Empire's brittle strength in the face of human adaptability. As Torres and his team slipped back into the mist, a quiet victory settled over them. They had proven themselves not just to the Empire, but to themselves. Captain Liam Torres crouched in the shadow of an icy ridge, watching the Empire's battered squad huddle for warmth and strategy in the barren wasteland below. The Empire soldiers' proud posture had crumbled, their heads low, voices hushed. A brutal reminder of Valzer's unforgiving environment and Earth's relentless adaptability had worn them down, leaving cracks in the disciplined veneer of their once mighty unit. The squad's leader, Lieutenant Iraq, looked desperately at his communicator, tapping it with frustrated movements as he attempted yet again to call for evacuation. Static hissed back at him, reminding him that his high-tech equipment was as much a liability as an advantage in this harsh terrain. His soldiers stared at him, their eyes filled with growing doubt. They had been conditioned to believe they were unstoppable, the elite force of a galactic empire. Yet here, they were fighting for survival against soldiers who seemed less like an enemy and more like the very elements of Valzer itself. "We need to pull back," Iraq muttered finally, his voice cutting through the frost-laden air. He glanced around, his gaze hardened yet defeated, as he realized that retreat was the only option left. This is no longer a mission, it's a slaughter. Above, Torres caught the words, his breath fogged in the cold as a wry smile crept onto his face. This was the moment Earth strategists had anticipated, and it had come faster than any of them had dared hope. Earth's so-called weakest had reduced the Empire's elite to a fearful, scrambling band of survivors. And now, with their resolve cracked, they were on the verge of breaking entirely. He raised a hand, signaling Novak and Norton to approach. They slid down the ridge, keeping low and silent as they gathered at Torres' side. Their faces were taut with focus, eyes sharp with the awareness that even now, the tide could change with a single misstep. "They're preparing to fall back," Torres murmured, his voice low but charged with anticipation. "This is it. We pushed them right to the edge." Novak nodded, her hands deftly adjusting the last few charges they had left. Small but potent explosives she'd fashioned into makeshift mines, hidden beneath layers of snow, planted along the Empire squad's likely retreat path. They were designed not to kill but to disorient and frighten, to drive the Empire's soldiers deeper into their own desperation. "Think they'll go for the bait?" Norton asked, his gruff voice barely a whisper. "They don't have a choice," Torres replied, glancing down at the Empire squad, watching as Iraq steeled himself to lead his team away from the frozen battleground that had claimed their confidence. They're past the point of second-guessing. With a nod, Torres signaled his team to fall back into their pre-established positions along the retreat path. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate. The Empire's soldiers, already stretched thin by exhaustion and the elements, would have to navigate a labyrinth of psychological traps where every blast, every disorienting noise, would reinforce the illusion that Earth's forces were closing in on them. The first mine exploded with a sharp crack, sending a plume of snow cascading through the air. Startled, the Empire's soldiers broke formation, each one glancing nervously at the shadows, weapons raised, as they struggled to maintain their composure. Another blast followed, and then another, as the mines went off one by one in a sequence meant to heighten their fear and disarray. Iraq spun around, his voice hoarse as he shouted for order, but the fear in his tone was unmistakable, his control over his squad slipping with every explosion. His soldiers stumbled, eyes wide, nerves raw. They were no longer the calm, precise unit that had landed on Valzer with every intention of subjugating its defenders. Now they were prey, haunted by unseen hunters in a world that felt as though it were actively conspiring against them. At the edge of the final ridge, Torres waited, knowing that this was where their last stand would take place. Earth's forces, hidden in the rocks, watched as the Empire's soldiers stumbled into their line of sight, desperate and broken. Torres's voice crackled softly over his team's comms. "Hold position. Let them make the first move." They waited in tense silence as the Empire's squad gathered below, unaware of the humans watching from above. Torres saw the weariness in their faces, the haunting doubt that now seemed to shadow every movement. They were beaten, and they knew it. At last, Iraq raised his hands in a signal that surprised even his own soldiers. He removed his helmet, exposing his face to the icy wind, his expression hard yet laced with resignation. His voice, when he spoke, carried an edge of defiance mixed with defeat. "We withdraw," he announced, his words echoing in the cold air. "This planet is yours. But this isn't over. Earth will answer for this." Torres, watching from above, felt a mix of satisfaction and foreboding at Iraq's words. This retreat was a victory, but it was only the beginning of a far larger conflict. The Empire would remember Valzer, and they would not take this humiliation lightly. But for now, they had achieved what they set out to do, to plant the seed of doubt in the mind of a power that believed itself invincible. He lowered his weapon and signaled for his team to stand down. They had succeeded. Earth's weakest had sent a message that echoed louder than any words. Resilience could be a weapon just as deadly as any laser or blade. As the Empire's soldiers retreated into the blinding snow, Torres and his team watched in silence, their breath forming mist in the frigid air. They had fought not with brute force, but with wits, will, and the indomitable spirit that defined humanity. And for now, they had won. But as Torres turned to lead his team back to their base, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was merely the first battle in a war yet to come. The Empire might have retreated, but its wrath would not be so easily quenched. A storm was brewing, and Earth would need every ounce of its strength to survive what was coming.